Let's resume the session with two videos. One is made by Vinton Cerf, who's one of the architects of the protocol TCP/IP. I don't know if you heard of CAR. This is what makes people or makes people communicate through this protocol. It's called TCP/IP. And Victor Cerf is one of their architects. So dating back to the 1970s, he created this, and he's like the father of the internet, where he has been participating in the SSIG. And he sent us a video, it's subtitled into Spanish, thanks to Lucas that created some of the captioning, and then I translated that. Let's see what his message is, and later we're going to see the rest of the videos.
Hello, my name is Vince Cerf. I'm Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist at Google. And I appreciate this opportunity to greet you at the South School for Internet Governance. Thank you to Olga Cavalli for this invitation. I want to start today's discussion with two topics. One is accountability and the other one is agency. These are two really important words, I think, in this 21st century internet. With regard to accountability, I think the key question here is how do we hold people, organizations, and even countries accountable for what they do on the internet? And why do we care about that? Well, some people do harmful things, and they cause problems for others who may be in different jurisdictions across international boundaries. The only way that we're going to succeed in creating norms and enforcing norms in the global internet environment is to adopt a practice of accountability for behavior online and providing incentives to guide those behaviors. So what that implies is that absolute and strict anonymity may not be possible, in fact, may not be desirable. What we seek, I think, is to be able to identify at need parties who are behaving in harmful ways. That may require international cooperation because of the victim and perpetrators being in different jurisdictions. Countries may need to come to agreement, for example, about what's criminal and what is not, and therefore assist each other at need in order to track down and hold accountable people whose behavior is harmful. Agency is another very important word in our vocabulary because we need to provide individuals, organizations, and even governments with the agency to defend themselves in the online environment. As much as we have seen the constructive benefit of a global internet where everyone has access to information, has the ability to communicate freely with each other, we also recognize that there are potential harmful behaviors and that this global system can sometimes amplify those undesirable behaviors. We see this in social networking as an example. And so we need to provide agency either by technical means or by legal agreements and by moral suasion to discipline bad behavior and to provide incentive for better and good behavior. We want the internet to become a safer place for people to work, to play, and to carry out their online activities. And to do that, we need to empower individuals, organizations, and even countries to defend themselves. So let's talk a little bit about the things which are currently top of mind with regard to the global internet. The first one, of course, is that it's not accessible to everyone. The estimates now are about 60% of the world's population having direct access to the internet. And over time, I expect that that percentage is going to go up, particularly now that physical infrastructure is becoming available, particularly by way of the low Earth orbiting satellite services, Starlink coming to mind and others as well. That suggests to me that it may be impossible to avoid access to the internet in the future as more and more of these systems become available. Moreover, there is an increased implementation of subsea cables linking continents and islands together with the global internet. And that too will increase the percentage of the population that has direct access. I think we can also observe that even if you don't have direct access, the others who do have access may have an impact on the way in which your life unfolds day to day, because decisions that they make and things that they implement through the internet may have a direct or perhaps indirect impact on your daily life. The thing that I believe we should be concerned about, however, is that this global system, which is designed around the notion of interoperability and global connectivity, is threatened by various and sundry kinds of fragmentation. My colleagues and I have spoken on this topic at the Internet Governance Forum as far back as 2013, where we outlined a variety of ways in which the internet can become fragmented. It's also important to keep in mind that the internet is a layered architecture, and the fragmentation takes place at different layers in the system. So the ability to inhibit fragmentation or to recover from it may vary. The remedies may vary depending on the layer in which the fragmentation occurs. So as a dramatic example, of course, some countries shut the internet down, and it's possible to do that if the underlying communication system doesn't carry packets anymore because you turn the radios off or you shut down the optical fiber networks. And some countries do that deliberately, perhaps during elections, for example, out of a concern that somehow the online services will distort the outcome of the election. One hopes that over time we can find ways of disciplining that kind of hazard so that the internet can become a source of useful information in the course of an election. For example, where do I go to vote, and how can I vote, and who is running, and what is their track record, and all the other questions that arise when the suffrage is at stake. The second thing that can happen, of course, is that some ISPs can, either on their own or perhaps because of a government order, filter traffic and not allow traffic to go to particular IP addresses, black holing, for example, or maybe blocking domain names and not allowing a lookup to take place. There are various defenses against that, one of which is to encrypt the DNS lookup, for example. And speaking of encryption, one thing I can say is that increasingly at the World Wide Web level, more and more users of the internet and providers of services are insisting on using HTTPS, which is the secure version of the Hypertext Transport Protocol that basically encrypts all the traffic end-to-end between the user's laptop, for example, or desktop, or pad or mobile, and the server that's somewhere in the cloud. So this sort of encryption for confidentiality is becoming increasingly common. Of course, there's tension because the law enforcement people will say, well, encryption gets in the way of accountability. And so obviously we're going to have to work our way through the policies that allow sort of piercing of the veil of that confidentiality. Another thing that can happen is content gets filtered. That can be done by demand. For example, some countries are insisting that providers of information, of user-generated content, filter that content in order to remove content that's considered unacceptable or undesirable. Of course, that's very complicated because of the 200 or so countries in the world may have very different views about what's acceptable and what isn't, which puts the internet service providers and the content providers or application providers in a quandary about how to satisfy every country's potentially different demands for content filtering. So that's a big challenge. There's also a question about privacy. There's a great deal of interest in providing people with privacy in the online environment. That's entirely understandable. On the other hand, absolute privacy may lead to a problem of bad behavior not being accountable because you can't identify the parties. So we have this tension between privacy and accountability and questions about who has the authority to pierce the veil of either privacy or confidentiality. There's also a big question about what's a crime on the internet, and there's a lot of discussion going on in many different forums about how to identify things that we might commonly agree are criminal in intent. There's also a question about reciprocity. If you're going to ask another country for help tracking down and holding accountable someone who is behaving, in your opinion, criminally, then you have to have typically an agreement on what's criminal so that both countries see the act as a criminal act and therefore worthy of cooperation. There's also a question about digital evidence and what mechanisms are used to obtain that evidence and to make it credible in a court of law, which may mean digital signatures and a number of other treatments that we come to agreement with on a global basis, or at least on a multilateral basis, so that when evidence is offered, it's accepted in another country's legal system. All of these, of course, are now open for considerable discussion, debate, and research. Another thing that is influencing this notion of fragmentation are rules about the way in which online services are offered. So in the European Union, for example, there's the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. How these things are defined and how players are defined and what requirements are laid upon them for satisfactory behavior in the online environment will vary from place to place. And that leads to potential fragmentation because the rules may not be uniform and almost certainly won't be uniform. There's another example of fragmentation comes with business models and tax treatments. As one example, in South Korea, there is a movement to try to adopt what's called a sender pays model, which says that if you're sending traffic into the network, you should pay for it. This forgets the possibility that the reason the traffic is entering into the network is because the customer asked for it. And so the customer may be paying for access to internet service from a carrier, and in fact, the charges ought to be levied on the customer for demanding access to content which is flowing from the other end of the network. So there's a lot of argument right now over what business model should apply and what tax model should apply. Again, another kind of fragmentation. As you're thinking about internet governance, it's important for you to have an appreciation for the various galaxy participants in the system. And it's an amazing collection of institutions: the Internet Engineering Task Force, the Internet Society, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, the regional Internet registries that manage IP address allocation, domain name registrars and registries, and standards-making organizations like the International Telecommunications Union. Important bulletin. Just in as I am making this video on the 1st of October, we just heard last week that that Doreen Bogdan Martin was recently elected the Secretary General of the ITU. This is notable for several reasons. The first is it's a woman. First time, I believe, that's happened. Second, she's an American, which is also a first. And third, she was elected by a considerable margin, all of which says that the ITU is now in a different state than it has been in the past. Other organizations that are part of the standards world, the International Standards Organization or Organization for International Standards, the 3GPP, which is an important part of the mobile standards activity, IEEE Standards Association, network operator groups that usually bring network operators together to talk about operational issues. What about the World Intellectual Property Organization or the World Trade Organization, or countries or, let's say, jurisdictional domains like the European Union, the European Commission, the European Parliament? These are all bodies that potentially have a lot to say about how the internet operates in one place or another on this planet. Speaking of which, we're at the cusp now of what I consider to be a very new opportunity, a new era, and that is leaving the planet and moving outward into the solar system. We've been exploring the solar system using robotic devices since the 1960s. We've had the International Space Station in operation for quite some time in near space. We now have, of course, the moon landing, American moon landing in 1969 was a major milestone. But now we have a return to the moon. One of those missions, an American-based mission, is called Artemis. And an associated mission is called Gateway, which is a kind of international space station that will be facilitating movement from Earth to the moon, to moon landing sites, to moon bases, laboratories, possibly even mines or other kinds of commercial activity. And so we're entering into an era where interplanetary communication is becoming important. Since 1998, a group that originally started at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which is sponsored by NASA, has grown to include most of the NASA laboratories and other space agencies like the European Space Agency, the Japanese Space Agency, the Korean Space Agency, that are collaborating and cooperating on the development of an interplanetary networking system using what are called delay and disruption tolerant network protocols. One of which has been evolving since 1998, is called the Bundle Protocol. It has a variety of features that are designed to deal with the variable delays and disruption that we experience in deep space environments, partly because of planetary motion, partly because of orbital motion, partly because of simply mobility on the surface, which obscures access by radio, for instance, because of craters that and mountains that get in the way. So we are on the edge now of entering into an era where humans will be off the planet and beyond low Earth orbit, and en route both to the moon and in the longer term to Mars and some of the other planets as well. So I'm quite excited to be a part of the group that's looking at the interplanetary backbone network as an evolutionary development over the course of perhaps the next 100 years, where standard protocols are introduced in the spacecraft that are used in space. And those spacecraft, if they're, for example, scientific missions, might complete their missions and be repurposed as communication nodes in an interplanetary backbone. Or we might anticipate that some spacecraft would be launched deliberately and specifically to support relay capability, store and forward relay capability in deep space. So this is all a very exciting time for the internet, as I see it. It's the beginning of the third decade of the 21st century, and opening up a variety of possibilities that will include networking on a really grand scale. So let me encourage you to continue your work in the Internet Governance School to come up with solutions to a variety of fairly knotty problems that still confront us. And hopefully, in the course of your discussions, you'll share insights that will be of value to all the rest of us. So I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but perhaps we'll meet on the net.
Bing has been working for years. Bing has been working for years, and right now, with the trips to Mars and to the moon, she has resumed the idea of networks that have a lot of delays because of the gravity and the distance, long distance. Very important topic, and right now we will screen another video of Andrew Sullivan, who is the president and CEO of Internet Society, ISOC, which is a non-for-profit organization that has many chapters. As a matter of fact, I'm a member of the Argentine chapter. There are chapters in many countries. Andrew sends his greetings. He couldn't be online because he had some other meetings. So we're going to screen his video, and later we'll start with infrastructure.